We're finally here, folks. Godzilla vs. Kong is almost upon us. The long-awaited rematch between the two greatest kaiju of all time has been a long time coming. 59 years to be exact. After their first bout way back in 1962, which saw the two go their separate ways after what amounted to a stalemate, these mighty titans have both experienced decades of sequels, remakes, and reboots, during which kaiju fans and film buffs alike have wondered just when, if ever, Godzilla and Kong would meet again. And after many delays, pushbacks, and pull forwards, we will finally see them battle for supremacy once again. However, to the layman, the hype may seem somewhat bizarre. What is it about Godzilla and Kong in particular that gets certain people, such as myself, hyped up? After all, Kong is just a giant ape. He can't possibly stand a chance against Godzilla, right? I mean, just in the previous movie, Godzilla faced a three-headed lightning-spewing dragon from outer space that threatened to destroy the world. Compared to that, Kong seems like a come-down. Surely Godzilla can handle him, right? Well, maybe in a certain sense, but the fact is that the significance of Godzilla vs. Kong lies less in any sort of objective power differences between the two, and more so in the history between the two. In many ways, Godzilla and Kong are the fathers of the giant monster genre. Without these two, we wouldn't have the sometimes goofy, sometimes haunting films that have brought so much joy and entertainment to millions of people around the world. And so, given this, now seems like a good time to highlight and celebrate this history. So come with me as we take a trip back to the past, as we explore the fascinating relationship between the two monster kings. This is the importance of Godzilla vs. Kong. It cannot be overstated just how important the original King Kong was to the evolution of filmmaking. When it was released in 1933, audiences had never seen anything like it. Sucked out of an economic depression into the story of an intrepid movie maker and his misguided attempt to capture a long-lost and ancient world on film, it instantly captured the imagination of those who paid a quarter to see it, and introduced them to the mighty Kong, here given the title of Eighth Wonder of the World. This was an apt description, because Kong was one of the first truly artificially created characters on film. While the art of stop-motion animation had been used before in previous films such as The Lost World, it had never been done before with such sophistication. Through the expert hands of animator Willis O'Brien, Kong was brought to life with a palpable sense of character. He felt truly alive, and the result was a special effect that felt truly special, allowing viewers to connect with the beast despite the film not really going out of its way to do so. And so by the time the monster made its now iconic and ill-fated climb up the Empire State Building, many viewers couldn't help but feel sorry for Kong as he was shot down mercilessly, punished for the crime of being plucked from his world and placed in ours. This gave Kong a sense of pathos that few giant monsters that came after ever truly matched, making the monster ape one of the most sympathetic movie monsters, a trait that would always remain integral to the character, no matter the interpretation. King Kong had an extraordinarily long lifespan, growing in legend with each passing year, and in doing so became the defining blockbuster for decades. Following a rushed sequel titled Son of Kong, it saw multiple re-releases in theaters, and every time it was a smash hit, raking in bank and capturing the imagination of generations, all while inspiring future filmmakers across the world. Eventually, the film was exported to other countries, including Japan in 1952, where it was also a massive success. This, along with the release of The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, inspired Tomoyuki Tanaka, a producer from Toho Studios, to make his own giant monster movie. At the time, Japan was in the process of rebuilding following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and had just had their collective trauma reopened after the fishing boat Lucky Dragon 5 was contaminated after unknowingly venturing near atomic testing being conducted on Bikini Atoll by the United States. This rocked a nation still in recovery, and furthered the anti-nuclear movement growing in Japan. These events informed the direction Tomoyuki Tanaka's monster movie would go. Along with director Ishiro Honda, himself a war veteran, the film, eventually titled Gojira, would deliver a potent anti-nuclear and anti-war message with pop culture sensibilities that would deliver a sense of catharsis to a nation still in mourning. The monster itself, a massive radioactively enhanced prehistoric sea-dwelling reptile, style, was presented as a living manifestation of atomic power, setting Tokyo ablaze with his radioactive breath without remorse. Unlike Kong, Godzilla was given little sympathy aside from the tragedy of his making his demise at the hands of Dr. Serizawa and his oxygen destroyer moving more so for what it represents than for the death of the beast itself. Released in 1954, Gojira was a huge success at the Japanese box office, and following in the steps of Kong again, prompted Toho Studios to rush out a sequel less than a year later, titled Godzilla Raids Again, which was a moderate success. A year later, Gojira was exported to the United States via an Americanized version titled Godzilla King of the Monsters, starring Raymond Burr. This version of the film was also a hit, both in the US and Japan when it was later exported there. Despite this though, Toho appeared to be done making Godzilla films, and over the years continued making original special effects films. And so it seemed as though Godzilla would remain, much like the film that inspired it, a single installment classic that had a significant impact on the pop culture of its nation. Fate, however, had other plans. By the early 1960s, Toho had cornered the kaiju market with more original special effects films such as Rodan, Varan, and Mothra. At the same time, in the United States, stop-motion animator Willis O'Brien had developed an idea for a new Kong film titled King Kong vs. Frankenstein, in which Kong would fight a giant monster created by the grandson of Dr. Frankenstein. O'Brien presented his idea to producer John Beck, who promptly bought the project and, unable to secure financing stateside, began shopping it overseas, squeezing O'Brien out during the process. This eventually attracted the attention of Toho, who'd long wanted to make a Kong film of their own, and so the studio agreed to finance the film if the Frankenstein monster was replaced with Godzilla. The studio was coming up on their 30th anniversary, and thought having Kong go up against their most famous monster would be the perfect way to celebrate. Toho taps the fathers of Godzilla to bring this historic matchup to the silver screen. Ishiro Honda was brought in to direct, Eiji Tsuburaya would handle the special effects, and composer Akira Ifukube would create the musical score, the latter of which would result in some of the most iconic tracks of the entire Godzilla franchise. To further mark the occasion, the movie was filmed in Toho Scope, Toho's patented version of CinemaScope, and thus presented both monsters in widescreen and color for the very first time. The screenplay was written by Shinichi Sekizawa, who would go on to write many of the Godzilla films that followed. The premise sees Kong being stolen from his island home and brought back to Japan in a desperate attempt by a fledgling company to boost its television ratings, while at the same time Godzilla breaks free from the iceberg he was sealed up in at the end of Godzilla Raids Again. Naturally, Godzilla uses his newfound freedom to go on a rampage, while Kong breaks free and does what you expect, finding a pretty girl and climbing up a historical landmark with her in tow, which in this case was the National Diet Building. In an effort to deal with both creatures at once, a plan is set in motion to have them face off at Mount Fuji, where they fight until falling into the ocean, where Kong surfaces and begins swimming back home, while Godzilla remains unaccounted for. Unlike the previous two Godzilla films, King Kong vs. Godzilla was made to be more family-friendly in an effort to appeal to a wider audience and maximize profits, but that doesn't mean the movie is lacking in social commentary. Honda and Sekizawa worked together to craft a story that satirized the television industry of Japan, which at the time was booming and resorting to extreme measures to grab viewers' attentions. King Kong vs. Godzilla skewers this reality, presenting the monsters less as menacing figures of destruction and more like pro wrestlers that the characters would root for. The film's most memorable character, Mr. Tako, is the extreme of this. He is the one who brings Kong to Japan to boost television ratings, and throughout the film fails to take responsibility for the damage he is the root cause of. Further adding to the comical tone is the way in which both monsters were presented. Both are given very human-like personalities, with Kong being presented as a drunken underdog and Godzilla a big bully who claps with glee when he inflicts pain. This was a far cry from the way in which monsters were presented in the West, which most often were made out to be either soulless killing machines or misunderstood creatures. King Kong vs. Godzilla gives its monsters personalities, to the point where you can identify with them as actual characters. Toho would continue down this path of anthropomorphizing its monsters going forward, which undoubtedly contributed to the enduring legacy of Godzilla in the kaiju genre. King Kong vs. Godzilla was released in Japan on August 11, 1962, to immense commercial success, selling 11 million tickets in its initial theatrical run. To this day, it remains the most attended Godzilla film of all time, and much of this was no doubt due to the presence of Kong. It's hard to believe now, but Godzilla was kind of small potatoes at the time. Even considering the success of the original Gojira, the 1933 King Kong had more history behind it. It had a greater legacy, and thus its influence on the global film industry was still being felt. Kong was therefore the more prestigious monster, so there was little doubt that he was a major box office draw, arguably more so than Godzilla, even in Japan. As part of the deal with Toho, Universal had the rights to distribute King Kong vs. Godzilla outside of Japan, and in an effort to make it more presentable to Western audiences, massive changes and additions were made. New footage was shot with American actors, in which a newscaster broadcasting from the United Nations would periodically interrupt the movie to explain the plot with some added scientific mumbo-jumbo. This gives the American version a drier, more serious tone, and the satirical nature of the Japanese version is replaced with broader comedy bits.
The corns. I don't want to hear about your corns.
Akira Ifukube's score is also replaced with music from older Universal films, giving it a wholly different soundscape. Together, these changes made the American cut distinctly different from the Japanese cut, though the overall story is pretty much the same. The existence of these two versions would lead to a long-standing belief that there were two different endings to the film. Supposedly, in the original Japanese version, Godzilla won, while in the American version, Kong won. This makes sense, given that the film acts as a sort of friendly rival bout between the two most famous monsters of the respective nations, which no doubt contributed to this belief for the decades that followed. It wasn't until the advent of the internet that the truth was revealed. The ending is the same for both versions. It was a relatively harmless myth that contributed to the film's legendary status within the genre. King Kong vs. Godzilla will go on to become the defining film of the Godzilla franchise. Its success gave Toho the confidence to keep making more Godzilla movies, and just a few years later they had him face off against their next most famous monster, Mothra, and once that proved successful, the series exploded. By 1975, Toho would end up producing 15 Godzilla movies, during which the King of the Monsters would gradually evolve from villain to hero, and in doing so established him as a pop culture icon of Japan, one that would continue to be exported into other mediums across the globe, including comics, video games, and television shows. So not only was Kong directly responsible for Godzilla's creation, he was also indirectly responsible for his rise in popularity. Had it not been for his match with Kong, it is quite likely that Godzilla would have remained a two-film monster, confined to a Japanese classic and its rushed sequel. But because his fight with his Western counterpart proved so successful, he went on to be the center of an entire multimedia dynasty that continued for decades, until eventually becoming arguably a bigger pop culture icon than Kong himself. Indeed, the irony in this is that Kong was never able to break out in quite the same way as Godzilla, and this is because it could never escape from the immense shadow of the original film. Aside from the Toho-produced King Kong Escapes in 1967, nearly every major King Kong film has been a remake. The first was the 1976 Dino De Laurentiis produced King Kong, starring Jeff Bridges and Jessica Lange, which took the inherently fantastical story into a more grounded direction, followed by another 3 decades later directed by Peter Jackson, starring Naomi Watts and Jack Black, a reverent 3-hour-long epic that embellished and relished in everything the original had to offer. And while both were massive pop culture events, they weren't franchise starters. Sure, there were attempts made, but in every case, they failed. This finally changed with the release of Kong Skull Island in 2017. For the first time, an American-made Kong film was not a remake or a sequel, but was instead a wholly original tale that took the character in new directions while still adhering to his core characteristics and mythology. Finally, Kong was no longer confined to pining over blonde white women and climbing tall buildings to his doom. Freed from his tragic fate, he was able to be a hero, fighting alongside the human cast against disgusting new creatures in a way that both pays homage to the past while setting up a bright new future. And to make it even better, strings were pulled behind the scenes to make this new outing connected to the current American-made Godzilla series, which had started in 2014 with Gareth Edwards' Godzilla. The stage was being set for Kong and Godzilla to meet again, under different circumstances, and decades worth of pop culture reverence behind them. And this is why Godzilla vs. Kong is such a major milestone for both characters and their respective franchises. These two are rivals in every sense of the word. The original King of the Monsters versus the one who came along and took his crown. It's East versus West, reptile versus mammal, God versus King. It's the perfect dichotomy, really. That's what made the original so enticing, and that remains to this day, 60 years later. It's not just two monsters fighting, it's two gigantic pop culture icons of cinema. Everyone knows who they are, and everyone has their opinion on who they think would win. This gives the matchup an extra layer of intrigue that attracts even casuals. It's very much like a high-profile wrestling match, which is what the original lampooned, which just goes to show you how ahead of its time it was. The rematch doesn't look to have the same sort of biting social commentary, but what it does look to have is an earnest sense of spectacle I and many monster fans can't wait to witness. Regardless of who comes out on top, the one thing we can all agree on is that it's a wonderful time to be a fan of these two rival monsters, and a privilege to see them come together once more. Long live the Kings.